It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. It is episode 51, and what a special episode we've got today. Rob, hello, how are you?
I'm really well. I am really excited to be putting this out there. So this is going to be the first guest interview we've ever done on the podcast, and what a way to start it off with Dan Andrews from the Tropical MBA podcast, the man who, it would not be a stretch to say, kind of inspired everything that we're doing with this podcast. We chatted to him just a minute ago, and we're going to be ready to play that out in a minute. So
if you're a regular listener to the Property Podcast, I'm sure you already know who Dan Andrews is. But if you don't, Dan and his business partner, Ian, have worked on several businesses for years, and they are very successful businesses. They turn over millions of pounds. They employ multiple people. He's going to tell us more about the businesses in the interview, but also he has a private internet forum called the Dynamite Circle, which Rob and I are both members of. It's a business community. We started the Property Hub really inspired by the DC because we loved having a community for business owners there, something we could be a part of. So we wanted to start it for property investors, which is what we've done. So, we're really, really enjoying that process, but it was inspired by what Dan's done. Yeah. So what you're saying basically is that everything we've done has been directly ripping off our guest this week. But one thing that he has not done is start a lettings agency. So we've actually managed to do something original. Woohoo! Hey. So we announced this last week. Go back and check out episode 50 for all the details. We won't go on about it too much now, but we are really excited. It's called Yellow Lettings. Get over to yellowlettings.net. Pop in your email address to find out more about that and when we're going to be ready to launch. But I'm going to have to hold myself back from talking about it too much because we've got to get straight on with this great interview. Let's introduce Mr. Dan Andrews. And joining us now is Dan Andrews. Now, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We've blown a lot of smoke up places we should have already before you've joined us on the call. But rather than us tell a passion-filled story about you, can you give us the background on who is Mr. Dan Andrews?
Sure. So my story sort of revolves around the desire for personal freedom. And in particular, for me, that meant owning my time and owning where I was in the world. It was really a bummer for me to sit on California's highways for 2+ hours a day and then sit in my desk for 12 hours a day. So I was really looking to address that big problem in my life around 2006, 2007. And I was really just throwing darts at the wall. I was playing poker, heaven forbid. I was looking into real estate investing. I was looking into short-term stock trading. Of course, I had negative capital at the time, so not too bright. But around that time, I stumbled onto the 4-hour work week. And it was this idea of starting a small internet business that really got me inspired. And so I just sort of jumped right into it. I had zero to lose. I had nothing going for me. And 2 years later, I started sharing the journey via a podcast and a blog, and like you guys are doing, and that's really how people got to know me on the webs. So here we are, 2014, and I've managed to survive.
Well, you've not just survived; you've built a couple of businesses, but it all started from you going and deciding to live out of a backpack on the other side of the world. And that's just like, millions of people have read the 4-hour work week. Not that many millions of people have actually gone and done that. So you were probably kind of alone in the strength of your desire to do that. I reckon most of our listeners are probably alone in their peer group in kind of thinking about their future and doing what they want to do. But how did you get the confidence to overcome the kind of the inertia and the groupthink that you get and actually strike out and do something?
I was just having this really entrepreneurial week last week. I was working on a new product, and I was making a P&L. And a P&L is like one of the most powerful things on the planet in your business. You put here's what I'm going to have to spend. Here's what I think I'm going to get. And then really I worked on it for literally 30 hours back and forth with messaging and this and that. And I was like, wow, this doesn't work. This just isn't going to get me what I'm trying to get. And it was the same concept that I took to my life at Tim Ferriss's urging. I made a dream line, which is basically like a life P&L. And I sat down and I wrote down the stuff that I wanted. And it was really the first time that I'd ever done that. It's kind of a simple exercise, but the way that I was raised, like, you didn't write down what you wanted. That's crazy talk. You find jobs to apply to. You find programs to join. And that was the first time in my life I ever sat down and said, look, I would love to live in another country for a year. I would love to work from anywhere. And when I sort of did my life P&L or my dream line, I realized that income from a job did not solve for what I needed. Like $150,000 in the bank when you have a salary doesn't solve for live in China for a year. That was a huge problem for me. I realized that I was on the wrong path, the path that I was on. So it became a lot easier then, because I was like, well, hell, like, all the things that I really say I want, I can't get them this way. So I got to figure out a new way. And it was Tim Ferriss and others like him who were sort of gesturing towards this world of internet business. And I was, I guess, desperate enough at the time to believe him. And I went for it. And, I got to say, it just wasn't, backpacks and beaches. It was very much like we started a manufacturing business with an office and a warehouse, and because that's what we knew. And we just sort of took what we knew and we said, hey, we got to own this. And even if it's small and desperate and puny at the beginning, it's ours. And I'd rather own, $1,000 of my own income every month than make $6,000 from somebody else.
I can completely relate to that. It's massive when money's coming into your bank that isn't paid by your boss. It's paid by your efforts.
Yeah, that's income from your assets.
Yeah. At a 4-hour work week, it's funny, one of my clients said to me last week, he goes, how's the 4-hour work week going? Because he took like a day to get through to me because it was so busy. He goes, how's it going? I said, well, I keep applying it, but every time I'm freeing up the hours, I'm doing more stuff. So it's like Tim Ferriss is just making us work harder.
Sweet irony.
We're not getting down to 4 hours. We're just keeping it 40, but doing more with it.
Yeah, it's like technology. The promise of a laundry machine is that you're going to do your laundry faster, but you end up just doing all your friends too. You just put more laundry through it. So, part of the reason that I've always been big onto this whole lifestyle business kick is that I never really had so much of a problem of asserting my personal desires. So long as our customers are happy, so long as our products are high quality. Ian and I Ian's my business partner, by the way, and he deserves most of the credit for what we've accomplished. We've never really had a problem with asserting what initially got us off the ground, which is, what do we want to do? Yes, maybe our business would grow a little faster if we sat in an office in California. That might be true. But we're not willing to do it, because the whole point that we developed these assets in the first place was to allow us to travel and to allow us to have creative freedom and to do fun stuff like a podcast that might not contribute so much to our manufacturing business, which is our bread and butter. But we did it anyway, because what else is the point, It's interesting you talk about you've got Ian there, but generally business owners aren't considered normal, a bit like property investors, and nor do we really consider ourselves normal, but you can end up, because of that, feeling quite isolated from normal society. So how do you deal with the potential isolation that being a business owner can bring? I'll tell you what. So I moved to California with all of my college friends, and we all got, the kind of entry-level career jobs, and we were all at that, first 5 years in your career. Before the internet was an opportunity for non-technologists and back in my day, I was cranking away at a job with all my friends. And one of the biggest transitions that I had to make when I decided to get out of that culture and into the entrepreneurial culture is sort of being around my friends less and changing the nature of those relationships. And that was really hard. I felt a lot of pressure to say, hey, where's Dan for the football game? Where's Dan for this? Well, Dan was locking himself into his apartment and trying to build a new life. And unfortunately, some relationships had to pass because of that. Those kinds of challenges really resonate with me, because it wasn't just like, oh yeah, screw it, I'm out the door. It was a combination of leaving some friendships behind and a lot of pressure from family. In particular, people who can appreciate a good job and can share that with their friends, like, hey, Dan's doing great. And now all of a sudden, Dan's trying to hustle cat furniture on a website, on a Yahoo store. And that's not something that goes over well at Thanksgiving dinner, so. And for me, it's a matter of, hey, how can you find a way to get through that first 2 or 3 years of the dip until you can come home with the pudding, the proofs in the pudding on Thanksgiving dinner and say, hey, we've made it. And that's going to take you a few years. It certainly did for us. Being around other entrepreneurs and listening to podcasts, I wouldn't have been able to do it without stuff like this, for sure.
Yeah, exactly the same here. I did a very similar thing, kind of quit, up and left, went and started again from scratch. And it was the podcast and the blogs and everything that gave me the idea in the first place. And then it was by connecting with people that kind of really gave me the motivation to stick with it and level up and figure out how it all worked. But at that initial stage, when you're trying to, you've kind of cast off some of your old friends who you're moving away from, and you know that you need to make some new connections and learn from people who've been doing it for longer than you. At that point, you have got nothing to offer, right? Like, you don't really get it yet. You don't have anything specific that you can give these people. So how do you worm your way into those circles that you know you need to be in when you're just getting started?
That's a really great point. And so for me, it's absolutely critical when you're starting out that you need to have a black box, something that's seductive to powerful people. You have to look, and this is pretty sociopathic, but whatever. You have to look at yourself and say, why do powerful people want to be around me? If you have a solid answer to that question, then you're going to have no problem networking and finding yourself in situations that can accelerate your progress. So for me, I was listening to Internet Business Mastery. Like, this was my podcast when I was sitting on the frickin' highway going to my stupid job. And I heard that the host was moving to San Diego and they were going to do this and that and the other thing. And I was like, screw it. Like, I'm in that mastermind. I'm finding a way to meet these guys. I'm going there. And I mean, I think the biggest thing for me is focus on the results that you've achieved and the things that you've concretely done. Being a leech is an absolute no. Being a bullshit artist is an absolute no. I mean, for someone that's advanced, having a really particular granular knowledge of how you drove 2,000 clicks via a Pinterest traffic campaign is extremely interesting and useful. And here's the great part. You can do a Pinterest traffic campaign this weekend. So if you're not willing to put up a website, drive some traffic, get some opt-ins, build some basic chops, then you don't really deserve to be in that meeting anyway. So my advice is hang back, take a couple weeks to do something, and then when you show up to the meeting, you can speak that language. And for me, it was important, I think, that I had been running a business for a few years as an employee, and it allowed me to speak that language. So yeah, I mean, it's a very huge and interesting topic, but I think it's an important skill to develop. If it's part of the game, I guess, is learning how to speak an entirely new language. And part of it is becoming a practitioner and doing the work yourself. People are going to be able to sniff you right away. That's the thing. This guy's green. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. This guy has no potential. And 9 times out of 10, it just comes down to, are you willing to do some work and talk honestly about your work? That's all the best podcasts and blogs, by the way. It's not people flicking on a microphone and talking about random mindset things. It's people that you can tell that they did the work, and then they flipped on the mic and they talked about the work. And I think that that's very attractive, both in content and in person.
I love that. You took it one step further. You didn't just try and get into groups and circles that you thought, oh, that's going to be useful. You went and set up the Diamond Night Circle with Ian. And so you've thrown your own party that you wanted to be invited to. You said, hey, here's the group I want to be a part of, so I'm going to set it up. There's a lot to be gained from connecting with people and putting yourself at the center of the scene, even if that's locally rather than online. But what's your biggest insight from building and setting up the Dynamite Circle that others can learn from? And by the way, for people listening, Rob and I are both members and we absolutely love it.
Yeah. So, wow, what's my biggest insight? Part of it is doubling down on what you're already doing, like pushing things to their logical extremes. You want to network with people. And if that's your main thrust and drive, why not build an enterprise around that? So that's sort of what we did. It was like, hey, there's nobody here in Southeast Asia. We've got a bunch of interesting people. Why don't we have a mastermind weekend? Similar to what you guys were saying, when we got there, we were like, this is so powerful. We should do this again, and it just kind of snowballed from there. So sometimes the best business ideas are right underneath your nose. You're trying to be overly clever and it's like, hey, everybody values this. Everybody's showing up. Everybody's having a good time. This could be an enterprise as well. And I think that was difficult for me. Running a business like Dynamite Circle it can be like a head trip because there's so many more mindset issues in charging people money for things. And is it really valuable? It's kind of soft networking. And whereas with the cat furniture, it's like, That's a piece of cat furniture. It costs us $100 to make. We're going to sell it for $250. That's the bottom line, And if we want to change that, we have to change our manufacturing process or whatever. Whereas with Dynamite Circle, I think it's been really cool, really challenging to think about how communities interact and how to provide value in that kind of situation. But like you said, I think we kind of stumbled upon it by continuing to push, this podcast and our blog to its logical extreme. This is what our listeners wanted from us, and this is what we were able to deliver for them. And it's been awesome. Awesome. Dynamite circlers are so much cooler than cat owners. That's the bottom line.
And in that Venn diagram, I'm sure there's a crossover of really cool DCers with cats.
Exactly. Jesse Lawler comes to mind.
But then you've not just got the community within the DC, you've also partnered up. So you've got Ian, who's your partner in these ventures. And you hear a lot about solopreneurs, and you overcome a lot of the loneliness issues, I guess, and the whole kind of self-doubt and everything else by having someone to bounce ideas off in what's normally quite a solitary kind of game. So what was your reason for partnering up when most people have gone solo? Was that something that just happened naturally, or was it intentional?
It happened naturally. So when I look back, when I look at partnerships as, I often say they're like dynamite. They'll either blow up your business or blow up your business, one way or the other. And there's so many problems with them. Ian and I got lucky. We were in the same financial position. I think that's generally important. We had the same financial goals. We happened to be very communicative people and honest people. I think one of the undervalued things about partnerships is the honest information that you get from them. So yes, there's the motivation issue, which I think is absolutely huge. But one thing that people don't talk about very often is the kind of honest feedback that you get about what you're doing when you're in a partnership. So we all have friendships where some guy will come to you with a business idea and he'll lay it all out, and he'll be really into it, or she'll be really into it. And it's not quite right. Something that they don't know, and you kind of mention it over a beer, and they don't really get it. They're not receptive to that kind of feedback. And then you do the math, you do the friendship math, and you're kind of like, you know what? I'm not willing to put this thing on the line to tell this person that this is a waste of time. So I'm going to let them go do it. Well, if Ian comes over that beer with me and he suggests something that's bunk, I'm not going to let him do it. I'm going to fight. I don't care. I'm going to be like, no way, man. You're 50% of this ship. No way are we going that way. And then you have those, classically, like when I was growing up, I loved Behind the Music, this documentary show about famous rock bands. And there's always at the core this like great tension of people just they're pushing each other to new heights. And I think Ian and I did a lot of that. There's a lot of, hey, that's not good enough. I'm not excited about that. What are you going to do about it? And similar to any relationship where you take it to the next level, like a marriage or anything like that. I often call it, I can't get married because I've already signed 50% away to Ian. And I have to minister to that. I have to make sure that he's happy and that I'm living up to those expectations. And I think you combine that up over 7 years, and yeah, there's a lot of upside potential with partnerships.
A lot of people, when they go into business, they're scared. So they find one of their best friends and almost drag them into business with them. Or they find someone at work and they go, come on, let's start, because it's out of fear. Were you really, really good friends with Ian before? You said it was natural, but was Ian part of your general sort of peer group at the beginning? Or you've kind of said it was natural, but I'm just kind of interested in how that process occurred in the beginning.
Yeah, I like to joke that I hired Ian. So Ian was this guy that we needed a designer at the company that I was running. And I was this young guy trying to run a company. So I would try to dress up and not be friends with anybody. And Ian kind of broke me down. I was just like, man, this guy's cool. So we started hanging out a little bit. And I think he installed a car stereo for me. And I was like, all right, this guy's really cool now. And we developed a friendship as peers. And that called into question the whole project of our relationship as employee-employer. And we started thinking about, hey, what can we do together? When it comes to networking and things, I look at projects take successful businesses, great entrepreneurs. They're not generally opportunists. And this could be a self-selecting thing. But I hang around with people, the people that I see having success, they're people that consistently come to work over the course of many years and bang it out. And when people say you don't want to go to work with your friends or you don't want to network with your friends, I'm thinking, really? You want to hang out with people you're not friends with for 4 or 5 years? Because that's how long it's going to take. So when I look back at it, I think I'm very glad that I went into business with one of my best friends. And I think it's improved our relationship over the years. And I can go to him on a very comprehensive, intimate level and say, hey, man, there's nothing that's not on the table. I think that, this relationship's destructive, or, I think that this is going wrong. And I think that that's worked for us. I've seen it work out in other ways, but for us, like, this business was our first. It was a lot of blood and guts. It wasn't like, oh, hey, let's chuck 50 grand a piece at it and put a manager in charge. Like, there's none of that. It was like, high contact sport. And so when I look back I'm glad I went into business with my best friend. Cool.
A lot of people looking into business, or, successful people in general, from the outside in, it's like, that guy's flawless, or that woman's flawless. They don't make mistakes. Everything they touch turns to gold. When in reality, it's far from that. And we all make mistakes. But what's the biggest mistake? And because in the DC, you'll see a lot of newbie business owners. What's the biggest mistake that you just see people starting out making over and over? Is there a common theme that you're seeing that you go, oh, not again? They're doing it again. Are you seeing that on a regular basis?
Sure. Yeah. It's so much easier to complain about other people's missteps than to stare at your own. I mean, one of the things I love about the DC is I love this position of quitting your job and having your first $2,000 to $3,000 a month cash flow and just being in that position where, man, I'm going to take it to the next level. Because when I look at people in that situation, I'm like, yeah, I could totally crush that. It's like watching a kid play Little League baseball or something and knowing you could step in there and hit a homer. Whereas when I look at my situation, I feel absolutely clueless and helpless as to what to do next. And therefore, I prefer to judge others in a more legible situation. Oh, the biggest mistake. Okay, so number one, people, they have a emotional aversion to a lot of the things that worked in corporate life and that they were regularly exposed to in corporate life. And so they hesitate to enter them into their own organizations. It's the 2 P's. It's policies or procedures, and it's people. So a lot of people, they feel like, I don't want to be a manager. I don't want to have a team, and I don't want to have standard operating procedures because those are the things that I'm running away from. Well, my constant encouragement to the young people in our community is that's exactly what you want. That's exactly what's going to bring you freedom from your business. Be disciplined about people and process, and you can be completely undisciplined about how you spend your days. The second thing I see is people not niching enough. There's this nature of the internet and information products and virtual businesses that you don't really have to box yourself in. You don't have to hold your feet to the fire like we had to do with physical products. I mean, look, it's a piece of cat furniture. It has a certain specification. It is what it is. Whereas an info product, it can just kind of be like a nailing Jell-O to the wall. So I see a lot of people come out with, very like, this is the Inspirational Dreamer podcast where we help people inspirationally dream. And like that kind of thing is, I think, pretty easy to take target at, and say, how are you really helping people? What's your focus? What problems are you solving? And so I see that a lot with beginners. I could probably go on for the next hour until I pass out into my keyboard, by the way. I'm going to stop there.
But it's interesting to hear you talking about process, because it isn't something that comes naturally to people. And I've incorporated a lot more process into what I do, thanks to your encouragement and lots of other people, and reading Work the System and the E-Myth and everything else. But where did that come from for you? What gave you the idea? Did you have that chaos and then you're like, this is it, this has to end? Or did the realization hit you pretty early?
I think it hit me really early because, my experience comes from running a 30-person company as the vice president of operations. So I relied on process and people, and that was my background. I did have this situation where, when I started my blog and podcast and sort of leveraged myself out of the product side of the business, which I think we probably have 12 employees over there now. So it relies heavily on process, and I kind of got out of there and I was like, sweet, I'm done, and I was just like backpacking around and writing about it and being an artist and stuff. And what ended up happening was like, Dynamite Circle came along. It's like, okay, this is becoming a little bit of work. And so I was like, well, what are we going to do with this new company? And so, I was reading books and stuff, and I thought, man, we got to kind of build this from the ground up again. We got to come up with a way to run this company. There was just one moment when I had created this document. I call it an SOD, a strategic operating document. And I remember having a conversation with my director of operations, Alyssa Doucette, and we were kind of like a little bit maxed out. And I was like, we should hire somebody, maybe. And I kind of highlighted a few processes, and I was like, well, these processes here make us about this much money a month. And I bet we could hire somebody for about this much money. And it's just like a light bulb went off. And I just kind of reminded myself of the power of these things and why had I strayed, you know? And so I think it was that moment when I got back onto the bandwagon and started telling people about the power of this stuff, because it absolutely, it's so obvious. It's so simple. And it just works beautifully. It's such an elegant way to run a business. Yeah, I mean, it's just been huge for our new business. Now we're up to 5 team members plus a couple of contractors, and everybody is coordinated very well. And what I just love about it is, you know, on a day-to-day business, it doesn't matter if I take a walk today or go traveling or go to a cafe. I've got 4 people every day building out my asset for me while I do whatever it is. And that's the beautiful part.
Yeah, that is a beautiful thing. And it's obviously taken a lot of work. It's taken a lot of learning. And I bet when you look back now at yourself 7 years ago or whatever, you're a totally different person. But if you could go back and give one piece of advice to new business Dan, what would it be? What do you wish that you'd done? You said you got to processes early, so you didn't make that mistake. But what do you wish that you'd done or known back then?
Yeah, so I got lucky with the people and processes thing, you know. I mean, the number one thing, and this is to go back to an earlier question you mentioned, the number one thing that stops people from starting a business is short-term cash requirements. That's just the bottom line, right? People need to live. And so they sacrifice the long and hard road it takes to build an asset in order to make short-term cash. That's just it. So if you can manage to live on rice and beans, I actually had a consulting contract very early in the game. So I didn't pay myself the first, say, $40,000 that spun off from my business. I immediately hired a guy named Alistair who still works for us today and now is the director of operations. That to me was always my mindset. Look, I'm building an asset. If my asset can't hire people or generate enough profit to hire somebody to proctor the asset, then it's not an asset worth having. So you want to run that experiment very early in the game. And so if you're taking the first $40,000 out of your business to live off of, you're holding yourself back from running that necessary experiment. So that's kind of just a general philosophical thing that I lucked into. When I look back on it, man, what would I do differently? I would have started blogging right away. I think this is the most cliched one, but I think being a practitioner and then telling your story, there's just this massive premium on people who are able to share that story and the connections you get from that. So yeah, I would have started right away building a mailing list of people who are interested in the kinds of work that I was doing. Who knows where we would have been had we started 2 years earlier on that front. So I don't ever look down my nose on someone who, you know, works for 70 to 80% of the week and then takes the last 20% of the week to share what they learned about their product, about their marketplace, about their entrepreneurial journey with others. There's a whole new premium on that kind of thing where we both kind of see it in the air. We smell it. We don't really know what it is, but we know that it's valuable. And the people that we can list off their names, Internet Business Mastery, the Pat Flynn was part of that group. I lucked out with him. It's amazing the people who get on that bandwagon where they end up a half a decade later. So the earlier you can start with that, absolutely.
What you've just said links into what I really wanted to ask you finally. You said people hold back from business from not having, you know, the funds or not willing to take the pay cut initially to real belief in the business. Or you could flip it on another way and call it fear. It's almost they've not felt enough pain to get out of the situation they're in. You know, they're scared of moving forward, but they're scared of losing what they've already established. What would you say to anybody thinking of starting a business but is holding themselves back because of a type of fear? What would you say to them?
You know, one of the things that Sean Ogle often says when he's interviewed on podcasts, he runs a blog called Location 180, and he says that people are always scared of the same thing, which is the unknown. I always thought that was kind of like a clever mind trick. So I think definition is one of the best ways to combat fear. And even in entrepreneurs, you know, you'll have people, they have a really unclear idea of what they're trying to accomplish. I often say, like, life is what happens in the meantime. So, you know, running a multi-million-dollar business is really this is going to sound crazy, but I think it's actually true. It's just as stressful and it's just as hard as having a job. In fact, it's probably less stressful. Yes, I'll cop to that. It's less stressful. So what's the difference? It's really just the amount of responsibility you're willing to take. Well, how do you take more responsibility? You have to define what you're responsible for. So just define big things. You're still going to go out for ice cream on Saturday. You're still going to go out and party with your friends. You're still going to go travel occasionally. But on paper, you're responsible for bigger things. So that's part of it. James Schramko from Superfast Business has a great thing. He flips the Spider-Man thing. He says, with great responsibility comes great power. And I love that. I think it's actually really true. And I think about that too. Like if I were just to rely on myself waking up every morning and feeling like a badass and feeling confident, I would be nowhere. But it's because once a week, I sit down with my weekly review and I say, I'm responsible for growing a $10 million business. And I'm still going to go for ice cream and I'm still going to feel like crap and I'm still going to do all the things that I always ever did. Except now I'm doing the $10 million thing. I'm just putting that out there. It's the first time I ever really said that. But I do like this idea of, hey, if life is what happens in the meantime, why don't you take on greater responsibility? So that's that. Wow. I just went on a big, long tangent. What was the question?
I don't know, but you mentioned something about the first time. So I think we got an exclusive there. So that's all I'm happy. We can say we've got a Dan Andrews exclusive quote here.
There is something I want to say about fear, though, which is that often what pushes people out of the door is that, you know, the pain of not going after what they want is greater than the pain of sticking, you know, with the sunk cost. I understand that, you know, having a career expertise and making $100,000 a year, whatever you've accomplished, that's a big deal. But not as big of a deal for me when I wrote out my dream line and said, can you imagine a life where you never live in a foreign country for a year? Can you imagine a life in which you can rarely go to a cafe on a Wednesday afternoon? Can you imagine a life in which a boss tells you what to do? And when you start to define those things, the fear starts to melt away. You know what I'm scared of? What I got right now. And not changing that 3 years from now. And so really, for me, when I looked at that dream line of mine, it turns out that I didn't have to be very brave. It was just very obvious that I needed to make a change. And so I got started.
It's pretty crazy when you put it like that. I think people assume that if they kind of keep on the path they're going, that if you're in a job, you're doing okay, the path that you're on seems to have served you reasonably well, and you maybe infer that at some point you'll be able to go off and do all the stuff you want to do. But then you kind of realize that no, like you take you towards one definition of success, but you are never going to be able to go to Japan for 3 months until you're 60 odd if you carry on this path. And it's that step of thinking about it and actually putting it on paper that's so powerful, which most people don't do.
It is. And you know, it's easy to rationalize the positions you're in. And I did it, certainly. I said, when I get a small ownership stake in this company, I'll be able to travel for 6 weeks out of the year and, you know, just making all these kinds of compromises. But it is an interesting exercise to say, what if I didn't compromise? What would I build? And I remember looking at my first dream line. There was 9 items on it. I can probably still, there were these kind of really highfalutin ideas. Like I want to work from anywhere on the globe. I honestly had no idea of how I was going to accomplish those things. But I think when you say, hey, I'm going to be responsible for it, I'm going to be responsible to myself to get those things done, things materialize. And it's kind of like you have to shut a door occasionally in order to see new opportunities. I mean, it's amazing to me what happened. I finally had the courage to quit my job, and immediately I got offered a consulting contract. That's not an opportunity that would have ever came to me had I been employed. Right? Because you don't offer employees consulting contracts. So it's just things like that, you know, you're not going to know. You're not going to be able to predict the future. And you got to get good at that if you want to live this lifestyle.
Dan, thank you so much for this interview. I've just sat here nodding my head and smiling, and I'm sure our listeners have done exactly the same. The problem is now, though, our listeners now know how much of a sham Rob and I are, because they're going, wait there, so Dan started podcasting. These guys started podcasting. He's got a forum. These guys have got a forum. Basically, if you want to know what we're doing next, ask Dan. Because whatever he's doing, we're following.
And isn't that great? You know, and I absolutely love it. And I can tell you the same stories of me doing the same thing. And that's the whole thing, is that Sometimes it's just right under your nose. You don't have to be a genius and reinvent the wheel. We know ourselves that these things are valued, that we love these podcasts. So if you're listening to this and you're nodding your head, maybe there's something right under your nose too. And you don't need to reinvent the entire wheel, that you can just do something similar to what you already appreciate. And that's where your taste is going to be the best anyway. So you're going to know how to differentiate yourself, how to do something unique, and just go for it. Yeah, why not? Great job, guys. I love what you're doing, by the way.
Cheers, Dan. Thank you. Well, Dan, I know we already follow everything you do, as we've just said, but if our audience wants to be as obsessive, where can they find you and what can they do to read more about what you do and say and talk about?
TropicalMBA.com. That's it.
Easy. Okay. Lovely. Dan, thanks again. We really appreciate your time. I know our audience is going to love what we've gone through today.
Thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
Wow. That was awesome. We're big fans of Dan already, but that interview was above my expectations. As I said in the interview, I was just, nodding along, smiling away, because some of the stuff, in fact, nearly all of the stuff he was talking about was just gold. You can relate so much of that back to property, though. That's what's really interesting, because we've talked about this last week, but property is a business. There's so many lessons that we can sort of pick out of that interview that we can apply directly to property. One of the big ones for me, Rob, was dreamlining. It's something we talked about in episode 25, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But dreamlining is something Dan mentioned, I think, more than once, and he found super, super effective for planning on where he wanted to go with his life, but also giving him a motivation to get there. By just saying you want to start a business or start investing in property, that's great, but unless you've got a real goal and a goal that relates to your future life that you want, unless you have that, then the motivation's going to wane pretty quickly. Whereas by having a dream, a life that you've planned out that you're aspiring to, it doesn't have to be, Ferraris and yachts, but whatever it means to you, whatever's important to you, by having that planned out, it's going to give you so much more inspiration when you're moving forward. That
really stood out for me. And since we talked about Dreamlines in episode 25, I've had quite a few people email me and say that they've been through that exercise and they found it really useful. And I'm always really pleased about that because, as Dan said and as we've said before, so many people just don't stop to think about what they want. And actually putting that down in writing is the first step to thinking, okay, well, is the path I'm on going to get me to that point, or do I have to start doing things a bit differently? And like you say, it keeps up the motivation as well, because things aren't always going to be easy. And I think Dan made that clear as well.
I did a dream line at the beginning of the year again, Rob, but this time I did it with my wife, and I learned a lot. I learned that she's got expensive taste. And I've got to work a few more years than I expected. But no, it's a great process to go through. In all seriousness, it really does motivate you, and it's motivated her to give me more of a hard time to work harder.
So it's worked out well for you, maybe?
Hence yellow letting.
That leads nicely into something that I picked up on from the interview, which is Dan talking about his relationship with Ian and the partnership that they formed. And I thought this is particularly relevant to property because so much of the time online you see people talking about joint venturing and sort of working with other investors. And that can be a great thing, but you often get the sense that people are doing it in a way to get around the problem of not having enough money or not being able to get a mortgage for some reason. I'm not saying that joint venturing is a bad thing by any means, but I think what Dan made clear is that a partnership entered into for the wrong reasons can go really badly wrong. But he's been quite intentional with his partnership. He knew that he was going into business with someone who he had a pre-existing relationship with. They got on. They'd spent a lot of time together. They were in the same place financially. They were willing to put in the work and do the same things. And as a result, their business has been so much more successful than either of them could have done on their own. And we've seen the same thing with partnering up on this podcast and now partnering on 2 other businesses together as well. But I think it's just so important to remember that partnerships can be great, but you've got to go into them with your eyes wide open and go into them for the right reasons.
Yeah, Rob and I, although we podcasted together, before we started a business, we actually interviewed each other. We gave each other a questionnaire, and it wasn't like 5 questions. It was, I can't remember now, it was a few pages long of different questions about beliefs, personal circumstances. It was a very personal interview that we both had to fill out. And then we went through that interview and talked through our answers. And it was only at the end we went, right, yeah, we feel we're a good fit. We didn't rush into it. Yeah, we work well on a podcast, but how about business? And we took our time to get there. It wasn't a rash decision. I think you have to be the same with any partnership. Don't just rush into it because you think, oh, this is going to easily fix the problem. Dig deeper. And that's what we did, and it's really paid off for us so far. So another point I took from the interview is action. Dan, he dreams, he puts his goals out there, but man, he's not afraid of taking action. He, traveled to the other side of the world early on in his business process and met up with new people, started his own forum, built a community. Dan is not afraid of starting things, taking action and seeing them through. And I think that's a big, big point. A lot of people will read books, listen to podcasts, talk to people, go to networking events, but they don't take the action. Now, I've been really, really pleased at the meetups we've done, Rob, the amount of people who've come up and said, you know what, I've taken action, I've started. And that's just fantastic. But there's so many people who will, be passive. Maybe they'll turn up to the meetups, not take action, who will listen to a lot of podcasts, read a lot of books. But if you actually look back, you've been doing that for 2 years and not done anything yet. Why is that? You can do everything else, but until you take action, nothing exciting is going to start.
Yeah, exactly. Getting started is a prerequisite. Nothing happens without taking that first step. And then another thing I took away from this was actually sharing what you're doing as you go along. So once you've got started, and talking about the process and showing that you've got something to offer. That could include blogging about what you're doing. And a couple of people in the Property Hub have shared blogs that they've got and where they've detailed refurbs that they've done. Well, not refurbs is kind of doing it a disservice. It's like a wholesale kind of rip it down and start again kind of thing. What they've done is amazing. But they've shared that process as they've gone along, which has been great for them. But it's also kind of pulled interesting people towards them who are interested in what they're doing, and opportunities might come from that. And I think that's really important, finding a way to show that you've got something to offer and to bring people together as well. So what Dan has done with the Dynamite Circle and what we've done with the Property Hub, there's no reason why that can't be done on a local level by just either getting a group of people together who invest in your area, or by starting a blog about property investment in your immediate vicinity. There are all these opportunities. And a lot of people are, I think, scared to put themselves out there. But the benefits are just absolutely incalculable. I only met Rob because I started a podcast and interviewed him for it. So good things come from just kind of putting things out there.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree. Well, talking about networking, discussing, let's get in the forum, everyone, and talk about this interview. You may have general business questions. You may want to discuss how these lessons link back to property. You may have just some comments, some feedback that you've learned from it, and you go, this is what I'm going to do, or this is what I've learned from it. Whatever it may be, go to thepropertyhub.net/Dan Andrews. So that's this episode. You can find it at thepropertyhub.net/Dan Andrews, and we can discuss what we've learned here. And you never know, Dan might even make an appearance too.
You never know. Well, this has been an absolutely brilliant way to start off this series. I'm really excited by the episodes still to come.
Yeah. Next week's episode is going to be awesome too. Next week, we have got Noah Kagan. If you don't know who Noah Kagan is, go and Google him. You'll definitely know who he is by the end of the interview. That guy speaks his mind. We're going to have to do a lot of editing because this guy does not hold back. He was employee number 20 at Facebook. Employee number 20 at Facebook. That is a massive achievement in itself. He then got sacked from Facebook. That is an achievement in itself when he was so close to earning millions of share options. He then went on to be number 4 employee at mint.com. Go and Google him if you want to find out a little bit more about him before next week's episode. But trust me, it's going to be a cracker.
It is. It's going to be quite something. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Do go and talk about it in the Property Hub. And we'll see you for another great interview next week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.